Snow fell silently on the morning of January 31st, 1945, blanketing the cobblestone courtyard in the small French town of Sainte-Marie-aux-Mines. Rifles loaded, breath visible in the freezing air. Before them, a young man stood tied to a wooden post, his body wrapped in a field blanket against the bitter cold. He hadn't murdered anyone. He hadn't raped or plundered. He had simply written a letter. Eddie Slovic was about to become the only American soldier executed for desertion since the Civil War. But his story doesn't begin in that frozen courtyard. It begins in the industrial slums of Detroit, where poverty and desperation shaped boys into criminals, long before the Army shaped them into soldiers. Born in February 1922, a working-class Polish family, Eddie grew up in a city where opportunity came through factory gates, or not at all. By 12, he was already familiar with police stations. A break-in at a foundry to steal scrap brass marked his first arrest. What followed was a cascade of petty crimes: theft, vandalism, resisting arrest, each offense adding another line to his growing criminal record. By 17, he was sentenced as an adult and sent to Jackson State Prison, one of the largest and most brutal correctional facilities in America. Prison didn't reform Eddie, it warehoused him. Between 1937 and 1942, he spent more than 4 years locked behind bars. He learned plumbing and mechanics, but he also learned something more fundamental. He learned that the system had already decided who he was. When he was finally released in 1942, he tried to rebuild. He found work as a plumber's assistant in Dearborn and married Antoinette Wichniewski in November of that year. For a few brief months, his life had structure, purpose, a future. But the war had other plans. By 1943, the American military machine was devouring men at an alarming rate. Casualties from the Italian campaign and preparations for the Normandy invasion meant every able body was needed. The Selective Service Board began reviewing files of men previously deemed unfit. Eddie's criminal past had initially classified him as 4F, morally ineligible for service. But as the body count rose, standards fell. In November 1943, his file was reopened. Despite his record, he showed no physical or mental deficiencies. He was reclassified as 1A and called up in January 1944. Eddie never wanted to be a soldier. Unlike the young men who enlisted with dreams of glory or duty, he arrived at Fort George Meade in Maryland already marked. His instructors knew his history. His officers knew his history. Ex-convicts like him were never trusted, never promoted, never given anything but the most dangerous assignments. They were sent as replacements to fill holes left by the dead and wounded, thrown into units where no one knew them and no one cared if they survived. In August 1944, Eddie was shipped to France and assigned to the 109th Infantry Regiment, 28th Division. The 28th was operating in Normandy's devastated countryside, advancing eastward through villages, still smoking from artillery fire. Constant rain turned roads into rivers of mud. German snipers lurked in tree lines. Mines waited beneath innocent-looking dirt paths. For a replacement soldier arriving alone into this chaos, the experience was disorienting and terrifying. During a night convoy move near Elbeuf, German artillery hammered the column. Explosions tore through the darkness. Men scattered. In the confusion, Eddie and another soldier, John Tankey, became separated from their unit. Lost and frightened, they wandered until they encountered Canadian military police, who took them in. The Canadians didn't treat them as deserters. They were strays, disoriented men caught in the fog of war. Eddie and Tankey were assigned to logistical duties and remained with the Canadians for 6 weeks. On October 7th, they were returned to the 109th Regiment. No charges were filed. Temporary separations happened constantly in combat zones. But when Eddie stood before his commanding officer that day, something inside him broke open. With startling honesty, he admitted he was terrified of combat. If sent to the front, he said plainly, he would run. The captain warned him of the consequences. Court-martial, execution. Eddie didn't flinch. He simply said he couldn't do it. Since no crime had been committed yet, the officer ordered him back to his unit. The next morning, as Company G prepared to move toward the front, Eddie walked in the opposite direction. He traveled more than 10 kilometers away from the battle line, passing through French villages until he encountered a cook from the 112th Infantry Regiment. What Eddie did next was extraordinary in its simplicity and devastating in its consequences. He handed the cook a handwritten note. The letter was written in pencil on notebook paper. The handwriting rough, but the message crystal clear. Eddie confessed to desertion. He explained that fear had paralyzed him during shelling, that he'd stayed with the Canadians for 6 weeks, and that he'd told his officer he would run if forced to return to combat. Then he wrote the words that sealed his fate. "I will do it again if I have to go back." The note made its way up the chain of command. Officers read it in disbelief. A soldier had voluntarily confessed to desertion and stated his intention to repeat the crime. Captain Himmel offered Eddie a way out. Tear up the note, return to duty, face no consequences. Eddie refused. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Sumner then summoned him for a private conversation. He explained carefully that desertion in a war zone was punishable by death. He asked Eddie to write a second statement acknowledging he understood the implications. Eddie took the paper, wrote that he knew what he was doing, and signed again. Even then, Sumner made one final offer: transfer to another regiment where no one knew him. A fresh start with no charges. Eddie looked at him and said no. He preferred trial and punishment to returning to combat. What made Eddie's case unique wasn't the desertion itself. Thousands of American soldiers deserted during the war. Between 1941 and 1945, over 21,000 cases were documented. Of those, 2,864 went to trial, and 49 received death sentences. But Eddie was the only one who confessed in writing, refused to recant when given multiple chances, and openly declared he would desert again. His honesty became his executioner. The trial took place on November 11, 1944, in the German town of Rottgen. 9 officers sat in judgment. The prosecutor presented Eddie's signed confession. The defense attorney said nothing. Eddie himself remained silent. There were no witnesses for the defense, no arguments about mental state or mitigating circumstances. The entire proceeding lasted less than 2 hours. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty, the sentence was death. In any other case, this would have been the beginning of a long review process, ending in commutation to prison time. Of the 49 soldiers sentenced to death for desertion, 48 would have their sentences reduced. But Eddie's case landed on the desk of General Dwight Eisenhower in December 1944. At the worst possible moment, the German army had launched a massive counteroffensive in the Ardennes Forest, the Battle of the Bulge. American lines were buckling under brutal winter conditions and ferocious enemy attacks. Desertion rates were climbing. Units were hemorrhaging men who simply couldn't endure the cold, the shelling, the endless dying. Eisenhower needed to send a message. The message needed a face. Eddie Slovik became that face. On December 23rd, Eisenhower signed the execution order. No mercy, no clemency. For the first time since the Civil War, an American soldier would face a firing squad for desertion. Eddie spent his final weeks in a military prison cell. On the morning of January 31st, 1945, a Catholic chaplain offered him last rites. Eddie responded quietly, "Father, pray for me up there. I'll pray that you don't come too soon." He was led into the courtyard wearing a uniform stripped of insignia. The snow continued to fall. 12 soldiers from the 109th Regiment stood waiting, each holding an M1 Garand rifle. 11 contained live ammunition. 1 held a blank. None knew which. Eddie was secured to the post with leather straps across his chest, abdomen, and thighs. A metal hook on his back kept him upright. A black hood covered his face. At 10:04 a.m., the order came. Ready, aim, fire. 11 bullets struck simultaneously. 4 hit critical areas: left shoulder, chest, upper abdomen, neck. But Eddie didn't die instantly. He hung against the post, still breathing, for 15 agonizing minutes. At 10:19, the medical officer finally certified his death. His body was wrapped in a tarp and buried in the Wazane American Cemetery, in a section reserved for executed criminals. No white cross marked his grave, only a metal marker with his service number. His wife Antoinette received vague notification that he had died in the line of duty. She wouldn't learn the truth for nearly a decade. The execution achieved its purpose. Word spread quietly through the ranks. A man had been shot for desertion. In the following weeks, desertion attempts dropped noticeably. Even as the Battle of the Bulge reached its most desperate phase, the army had made its point without saying a word. But the story doesn't end in that frozen courtyard. The other 48 men sentenced to death for desertion all survived. They had officers who interceded for them. They had medical evaluations diagnosing combat stress. They had timing on their side. Their cases reviewed after victory seemed certain when mercy became easier to grant. Eddie had none of these advantages. He had a criminal record that made him expendable. He had written proof of his crime that made him undeniable. He had the misfortune of perfect timing, his case reaching Eisenhower's desk when an example was desperately needed. Eddie's execution stands in stark contrast to unpunished crimes committed by other American soldiers. Hundreds of cases of rape, murder of prisoners, and violence against civilians were documented during the war. Most never went to trial. Perpetrators were transferred, dismissed, or quietly protected by their commanders. Eddie Slovik killed no one, harmed no one, destroyed nothing. He simply refused to fight and was honest about it. That honesty killed him. In 1954, journalist William Bradford Huey published The Execution of Private Slovik, revealing the full story to the American public. Antoinette spent the rest of her life fighting for a posthumous pardon and veterans' benefits. She was denied both. When she died in 1979, she was buried alone. In 1987, Eddie's remains were finally exhumed and brought home. He was buried beside Antoinette in Detroit's Woodmere Cemetery. His headstone bears his name, dates, and rank. It says nothing about how he died. Eddie Slovik's execution was not an act of justice. It was an act of strategy. He died not because his crime was the worst, but because his visibility, his honesty, and his timing made him the perfect symbol. In the brutal calculus of war, one man's death was deemed acceptable to prevent hundreds more from following his path. The army needed absolute obedience, and it was willing to kill one of its own to get it. The question that haunts his story isn't whether Eddie was a coward. Fear is universal in war. The question is whether a system that executes a man for admitting fear while protecting those who commit atrocities can claim to serve justice. Eddie Slovik didn't die for desertion. He died for being honest in a war that demanded lies. He died for being expendable in a system that needed an example. He died because 12 men fired their rifles on a snowy morning, and because one general signed a piece of paper, and in the end, perhaps that's the most terrifying truth of all. Eddie Slovik's crime wasn't running from battle. It was believing that honesty might save him when silence would have kept him alive.